Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of Rapping with the Rep, and I am State Representative Ken Gordon, and I'm really excited and grateful that we have Assistant Majority Leader Alice Peisch, the representative from Wellesley. Welcome to our show.
Thank you, Ken. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And Representative Peisch, Leader Peisch, chaired the Joint Committee on Education for 12 years, essentially prior to the time that I became the chair of that committee. So you have essentially 14 of 18 years of leadership of this committee, which is so important to this district and really most every district, because it's our responsibility to provide a public education to our kids, and we're the committee that oversees policy that is directed at that K through 12 education. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation. This session, we led on some important policies and accomplished some important goals, all of which are making their way to the governor in various stages. We previously talked about what we call evidence-based literacy, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the end because that's making progress. We had Representative Simon Cataldo on to do that, but most recently, the House joined the Senate in passing a bill that includes restrictions on cell phone access in schools. And we'll start off by talking about that because I'm really excited about the way that we're going to address distraction in public schools, mostly high school, but also middle school. This is something that you filed, Leader Peisch, and have been working on for quite some time, right?
Yes, it is. This issue was brought to my attention a few years ago by a child psychiatrist who lives and practices in my district. Who got in touch with me, wanted to talk about it, and when she first raised the topic, I responded by saying, well, my understanding is that cell phones are not permitted in classrooms, and so what is the problem? And her response was quite an education for me, because she told me about the fact that, yes, cell phones are in fact prohibited at most schools in the classrooms, but nonetheless, they are in most schools. I know many have changed their policies, but at that point, not very many had. And the students would, particularly at the middle and high school levels, would have access to their phones between classes, as well as during the lunch break. And what she reported to me was that as a result of that, they were very distracted, difficulty concentrating. Even in the classrooms, they couldn't wait until the break so that they could get out and check their phone. And that was leading to significant inattention in classroom. And the description that she gave that really struck me was that when you walked into the high school cafeteria, it was silent. Now, the last time, I have to confess that I was in a high school cafeteria, it was the opposite of silence. And that was the time when the kids all got to know each other, interacted. The idea that they would all be sitting there staring at their phones and not engaging with each other, I found quite disturbing. And then, subsequent to that, I had occasion to visit Wellesley High School, and I asked the teachers about this. And they confirmed what the child psychiatrist had told me, and additionally talked about the fact that they could no longer assign readings of a certain length because the kids' concentration was in fact too low for enough of the students to be able to concentrate on a longer reading. So I found that quite disturbing. And the second piece of it was not just the inattention, the lack of concentration. It was also the really negative impact of what I would term bullying over the phones in various chats and so on. And this doctor was telling me how she had a significant increase in her patients with mental anxiety caused by this bullying that was occurring over the cell phones. So that, to me, this combination of the bullying as well as the lack of ability to concentrate really persuaded me that we needed to do something.
Yeah, and then it wasn't just this one psychologist who spoke to you, because over time after you filed this bill, it came to our committee, and we heard from group after group, psychologist after psychologist, with one story, and it was the story you just told. One message, which is that what's plaguing our students in these years, in this generation, is the distraction caused by cell phones in schools. Is not only, it's not that there are calls coming or texts coming during class. That's less common. It's what you said, it's between classes. The student has maybe 5 minutes, the first thing they do is they check their phone. They may get upsetting news. It may come from a friend or someone with a different kind of a relationship. And they go to class and they're not prepared to listen, pay attention, and learn because they're still thinking about the ramification of what they just read and thinking about that they wish they could just respond, and they can't because now they're back in class. So all of this is something that they're thinking about, and they're falling behind because by the time they're maybe ready to look up and pay attention, they don't really know what the lesson is that's being presented.
Exactly. And I think that we heard this, as you said, time and again. It wasn't, I heard it not just from this particular physician who practiced in my district, but I started to talk to school superintendents and teachers and others. I mean, some of what I was hearing was anecdotal. My daughter is a high school teacher, and when I asked her about it, she had exactly the same response, and her response was, this would be very helpful to have cell phones banned, what we now refer to as bell to bell in the schools.
Right. And when I first picked up the issue, I thought it would be sufficient to go class to class because the schools in my district are class to class bans, and many districts are, as you said, are class to class bans. And I hadn't yet really come to an understanding of why the between class is important. And I hadn't come to an understanding of what you just said about the lunch period or other breaks during homeroom or breaks during the school day. Is these are times when social skills are developed. This is time when the friendships that can last quite some time after high school are developed. And as you said, I've seen and then heard from others who say that they walk into, say, a homeroom, and it's not 30 students together, it's 30 students all in their separate space because their heads are down in their phone and they're looking at various applications that are attracting their attention rather than developing those skills of learning from each other.
Precisely. I think it was sort of, you've pointed out the fact that there's a twofold damage that's occurring. One is the inability to concentrate on what the teacher is attempting to teach, and the second is that development of social skills, which is critical to their development into a well-functioning adult in society.
So the way that this is currently done, and then we'll talk about what the bill does, but the way that this is currently done is many of the school districts that have restrictions on cell phone access do it through a method that we call the shoe tree method, and I think that's used here locally, which is that the student gets into a class and they put their phone away into a box. And the teacher, I think, expects and hopes that all the phones are in the boxes at the appropriate time. But the teacher still has to keep an eye on whether that's actually happening. And even in a bell-to-bell restriction, you could accomplish that by putting a room, providing a room that all the phones go into a room. Someone still has to manage that, and when a phone isn't there at the end of the day, I don't know who's responsible, but there'll be an issue, right? So that's one. But that's one way that districts can do it. And another way that district can do it is through the use of what they call a yonder pouch. It's a pouch, and I don't know any other way that it is provided except for this is what they're calling it. And the students will lock their phone into a pouch. It magnetically seals, and then at the end of the period or school day, if it's built, right, they get it out that way. These are all ways that we will allow districts to continue to do that as long as it's bell to bell.
Correct.
In our bill. Our bill on the House side does something similar. Now, what I just explained is also in the Senate side. The Senate also is bell to bell, so we agree on that. And we agree to allow the districts to determine how they want to accomplish it. But we've talked to a number of companies that have a technological means of accomplishing this goal. And we think it's worth exploring for the benefit of the district. In other words, we're not going to make the decision for them to do this, but we want to show them this option. And so we provide for a pilot program, a 2-year pilot program, and the companies can participate if they choose, and districts up to 10 can participate if they choose. And what I'm hoping is that we will select different types of districts, rural, urban, large, small, to have a good sample size of how this works. And the way it works is that currently there is one district trying out this type of a program in Watertown, where the students tap in their phone. There's a magnetic or application or some way that the phone connects to a strip, and it takes their attendance and their phones become restricted. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is by geofencing, which is to say that there's an app on the phone, and when the phone goes into the geofence, it shuts itself off, except for apps that the district wants to remain on. And that's another way to do it. So there are all these ways that this can be accomplished, some without cost at all.
Yes, and I think actually the pilot that you're referring to has there's a lot of potential there, because one of the complaints that I'm sure you've also heard is that there's an awful lot of responsibility being put on the individual teachers to monitor whether or not the phones are in fact either in these yonder pouches or boxes or wherever. And in fact, I've also heard of situations where students will acquire a second phone. That phone goes into the box or the pouch, and their actual phone is kept on their person so that they always have access to it. And the ability for teachers and administrators to keep track of that is very challenging. So I think this technological component or possibility is very could have some really good benefits, because not only would it achieve the goal, our primary goal of limiting the students' access, but also it, in theory, will make it much easier for the school districts to administer. And one of the other, as I understand it, benefits is that our legislation, both in the House and the Senate, does allow for some exceptions. For example, there are some students that, for example, who might have diabetes and need to keep track of their sugar levels, and they do that via an app on their phone. This technology is very sophisticated, and it could allow a student's phone to be completely shut off but for that particular application, which again makes it much easier from an administrative point of view to ensure that the students do not have access to the things that are causing the problems, but at the same time they do have access to very important life-saving applications.
Right. Among those applications would be the ability to call 911.
Correct.
If there's an emergency, or if the student, say, becomes injured with no one around, so you haven't separated the student from the phone to that extent. It really would be up to the district. If the district found that there's a calendar app and they wanted their students to be able to keep track of their homework or other things like that, they could pick and choose. The example that you mentioned, someone with a medical need for their phone, that student wouldn't be the only one with access to a phone in the class, because an exception for that student, or a student on an IEP is another exception. They wouldn't be singled out when they took their phone out. Oh, that student has a need for that phone. This way everyone does. It's just that not everyone has the need to use the apps that are available. Another criticism that we get is who's going to pay for it. And the way that our legislation works, in the Senate, frankly, is that some of these options are free. Some leave your phone at home, for example. If you don't want to have an app on your phone, leave it at home, right? That'll work. But this technological means there's no front-end cost. There's no equipment that the district needs. It's all digital-based, provided by the provider, so there's really no upfront cost. There's certainly, after the app, there's a per pupil cost, I understand, is somewhere between $5 and $8 per pupil per year, something in that range at this point. But there's a cost for each of these methods, and the methods that the schools are using now. There's still cost for the space to put the shoot tree.
Correct, and actually I was pleasantly surprised to learn that the cost of this technology option appears to be significantly less than the cost for these yonder pouches that are utilized quite broadly, even currently in districts that only have the classroom prohibition, in that the kids will stick it into the yonder pouch when they come into the classroom. Those pouches are A, not inexpensive, and B, I recently learned, do not last very long, so that I was recently at my town meeting where one of the budget items on the school's capital plan was the replacement of the yonder pouches at a not insignificant cost. So I think this, I'm very hopeful that this technology will really be the answer to how this gets implemented in a way that works, and to your point, can be designed to meet the needs of each district depending on what they are.
Yeah. Going back to something that's classic and tried again, is that the legislation, both the House and the Senate side, says that the district is required to provide the parent or guardian or appointed person with at least one way to reach the student, and the other way around, the student to reach out to a parent or guardian or so forth. The way that's been done for decades has been to call the office. And if there's something going on at home that a parent or guardian needs to bring to the attention of the student, they'll call. And the message will get through, if that's what it takes, or if that's all it takes. If it's an employer that has a need for that student, the employer will leave a message. And I can't imagine why the person at the front office won't take that message for the student, and the student will just get a piece of paper between classes at that point. There will be something, and they'll call after school.
Yes, that seemed, I mean, as you mentioned, this was a policy that was in place for decades and seemed to work quite well. So I know there's a little bit of anxiety, as there always is with change, but when you look at the benefits versus the costs, and the costs that we are currently paying in a variety of ways by not having this policy, I think makes it very clear that this is the right direction in which to move.
Now, we should talk about the other portion of the bill that the House put out, and it was only about a week ago, I think, that we did this. And this deals with social media access among children. The bill that we sent from committee, that again was your bill, calls for education in schools about social media and about some of the effects that social media has on our kids. To be careful, because this is educating our kids, to be careful about the amount of time spent on social media away from your family, but also some of the risks. You know, when you're on social media, you don't exactly know who you're speaking with. These are people you haven't met in person, and they purport to be who they say they are. We don't know who they really are. And there are a lot of risks that have gone on classically that we know about through interaction between anonymous people establishing relationships with each other. Mostly that works out. We're not saying that the vast majority of the time people are who they say they are, but we've seen examples over and over again of kids getting tricked into relationships with adults, for the most part, right? That they didn't realize that's who they were talking to.
Yes, and I think it's really critical that education piece of the bill be maintained. I heard from many experts in the area about the need for students to understand not just the risks involved in, as you point out, maybe encountering someone on social media who is not who he or she says they are, and then later on having some awful thing happen as a result, but also teaching the students how to evaluate the information that comes across via social media, and understanding how you determine that something is accurate. And because I think we have all seen increasingly statements made that are not coming from what you and I would consider to be legitimate sources, you know, these standard press outlets and so on, or academic institutions, but organizations that, you know, have names that sound impressive, but there may not be anything behind that name, and yet information is coming through. And if you don't appreciate that just because it's on, quote, the internet or social media does not make it accurate, then you run the risk that our students are going to grow up not understanding that everything they hear is not true and needs to be verified in some way.
Yes, skepticism can really be productive and constructive in so many ways when someone reads something on the internet. Is that true? That sounds a little far-fetched. Is that true? And the internet can also be used as a tool to chase down whether that information is true or came from an accurate source or so.
Yes, I see this education about social media and the internet and how to evaluate it as not unlike going back a number of decades when calculators were first introduced into schools. And I can recall hearing concerns that you know, the students would never learn math because they would just kind of input the numbers into the calculator. And in fact, the practice in all schools that I'm familiar with was not to replace the learning of math with the calculator, but to use the calculator as a tool. And you had to learn enough math so that you knew when you got an answer from the calculator whether or not that was likely accurate, because you had, if you know, you knew enough multiplication so that when you put in 2 times 100 and the answer came up 3, that couldn't possibly be correct.
Right.
And I think the same thing applies to social media. You're not going to be able to. Excuse me. Let me rephrase that. I think that there is enormous benefit to students and adults being able to access all kinds of information that we never had access to before. But we need to learn how to evaluate it properly so that we do not end up relying on misinformation.
Thank you. And you also bring up a good point about AI in education, and that'll be the subject of an upcoming Rapping with the Rep, because that's so complex. It's so useful. It's part of our future. It's there. Our kids have to understand its use, respect its use, but also understand the risks of it. And so our Joint Committee on Education really has challenges ahead of us, has important issues before us. This bill, the social media, which is tied to the cell phone bill, is going to most likely go to a conference committee, because either the Senate would just agree with it and would go to the governor. More likely than not, each branch will appoint a committee to work out the differences. So that's where it is procedurally. The bill itself, what it does is it restricts access, in fact prevents access, to children up through 13 years old to social media, and then requires parental consent for 14 and 15-year-olds. After that, they access social media as would an adult. I saw, interestingly, that the social media providers or platforms such as TikTok or Instagram already have in their policy that if you're 13 or younger, or I think it's younger than 13, then they don't sign, you can't get an account. So they're already doing that. So if there's any controversy to the age, they're doing that. But now, as a matter of Massachusetts law, they have to do that, which is a little different, right? And what we do is we say that the Attorney General is left with the responsibility of finding a responsible means of carrying out the goal that we have of banning access to social media through 13, and then 14 and 15 parental consent. So there's a lot of responsibility that goes to the AG, and I know that there's been some reaction assuming what the AG will do, but we're not there yet.
Correct. There is. I have read some criticism of this portion of the bill that claims that the bill requires all kinds of private information to be shared with the provider. None of that is in the bill. To your point, the Attorney General is simply directed to promulgate regulations as to how this legislation will be implemented. And I think people are speculating that the worst possible way of implementation is what is going to happen. There is a process. There is always public input into regulation. And I have every confidence that the Attorney General will do a good job in ensuring that the regulations that are ultimately promulgated will make it more or less easy to enforce this provision without getting into some of these privacy issues that people have raised as concerns.
Yeah, I mean, if, as the Attorney General has this responsibility, if people from various groups or individuals come to the Attorney General and say, well, this method will expose all this private data. Well, the Attorney General could, yeah, that's not reasonable. That's not a reasonable way to carry out the policies of this bill, so we'll think of another way. We're not there yet, but that's the conversation that would go on at that level. Where we are, however, is recognizing the reason why there's a need to regulate social media access from among our kids up through 13 and then 14 and 15 parental consent. We see, going back to the sociology of it that you mentioned on Cellphone, the same thing here. Study after study, group after group show that as a matter of public health, our kids are facing situations where they have increased instances of anxiety, depression, body shaming. You know, they're seeing images of people. Not
to mention the potential for predators to exploit this kind of a situation. So I think there is no question that the dangers presented are quite significant, and yes, it's going to take some real thought to come up with an implementation process that respects our privacy, but by the same token, I don't think we give up on restricting this just because of the fear that these requirements may be invasive. That I don't believe will be the case.
Yeah. Now, another issue that's come up has been the First Amendment right out there of communication, right? And while that's the case, we do have a First Amendment right to speak, we restrict speech among or with children in many ways. There are many sites on the internet right now where a person has to verify that they're of a certain age to use that site. This wouldn't be the first time. And so many states, and I think we're up to 18 now, have various degrees of restrictions of access for children to the internet. People may have a right to choose to smoke, probably not a constitutional right, but some sort of a right. But children don't, and that's certainly enforceable because it's a matter of public health. And so finding that balance between public health and conversation is important. And we're at that point where we've got to look for that balance and not focus on just one thing to the detriment of public health for children.
Exactly, and as I said, I'm very confident that this will be implemented in a way that strikes that correct balance.
Okay, well, I see we're out of time. Leader Alice Peisch, thank you very much for coming here and speaking with folks on Rapping with the Rep. It's been an interesting conversation, and thank you for being here.
And thank you for having me.
Thank you.